All right. So thanks again, Carl, for being here. And what I wanted to open up with
My pleasure.
is I grew up with Greek mythology and I love Greek mythology.
Mhm.
But in the past 5, 6 years, um, I've been exposed to Norse mythology. And the love I have
Mhm.
for that, dare I say, it might surpass my love for Greek mythology. I'm curious,
Right.
is there anything about, is there any particular thing about Norse mythology that strikes you the most fascinating?
That's a very good question. I think what the increased popularity I think in Old Norse religion and myth has really increased over the past few years, especially of course because of pop culture. Pop culture does drive the popularity quite a lot, and of course through the TV series like Vikings, for example, or Vikings, whatever it's called, the History Channel one, and of course through video games like God of War and all that started focusing a lot on the Old Norse mythology. But I think what is so attractive perhaps is that the stories are just cool, actually. The stories about Norse mythology, they're so cool. The gods are so cool. There's so much weirdness happening and so much violence as well, really. And it's so rife for telling and retelling, isn't it? So that's I think why it's so popular. The stories are infinitely reusable, and the characters themselves look like they would fit right in what is fantasy today, right? The popularity of fantasy, and of course, certainly Tolkien has helped. Tolkien himself was a scholar of Old Norse literature and Old English, medieval literature, and he was very well versed, certainly, in that and in that whole field. And Lord of the Rings is just full of elements from there. So I think it is fascinating. A lot of people, when they start reading a lot of the material, like the Voluspa, for example, a lot of the literature that we have about Old Norse mythology, they start seeing elements. They say, "Oh, this is familiar. I've read this somewhere, or I've read something similar. I've read the name there." So see something like Gimli, and it's mentioned in the Old Norse literature, and Gandalf. All of that. That those are taken wholesale from there. So it's a really weird thing, perhaps. People who start getting familiarized with Old Norse mythology, that it's like it's interesting and new, but also familiar. I think that is what is quite attractive, perhaps. This is something that, yeah, we've seen this before. These are very relatable, perhaps. I wouldn't say relatable with the gods because they were absolutely insane, but the stories themselves are quite familiar for most people.
Yeah, and you mentioned a great part of it of how they can be so reusable and relevant. And
Hmm.
the one story in particular that attracts me the most is about the Allfather Odin and how
Hmm.
he's constantly in search of a way to change his fate, of a way to
Yeah.
avert destiny. And I feel like a lot of people can relate to that, and that's just a very human desire. Is there a particular story
Yes.
from the mythos that speaks to you?
Speak to me. I mean, I wouldn't. Perhaps more than speak to me. I think it's more the perhaps the story that most amuses me, I would say, because I think this is the thing as well with the mythology. Yes, you can get maybe lessons from it, or you can be inspired, but they're also fun. They're also funny. There's a lot of humor in there as well. And this is sometimes something that sometimes people maybe don't compute, perhaps, because we think of an old religion being, it's serious. Religion is supposed to be serious and all of that. But with these folk religions, perhaps, because these are not organized religions, right? This was a folk belief amongst tribes of people throughout Scandinavia. This wasn't an organized religion. It's also humorous. It's meant to entertain at the same time, right? So I think my favorite story is Trimskvida. It's the story of the giant Trim stealing Thor's hammer, and they really try to get it back. And the only thing that Thrym wants to do is to marry Freya. He just really wants to marry Freya, and Freya just, yeah, absolutely not. She doesn't take any of that. Freya usually is shown as this sort of very strong female character. She absolutely refuses. Like, I'm not going to do what you tell me. So the only way to get it is for Thor to dress up as a woman and as a bride, and then go to Thrym disguised as Freya, and then they get married supposedly in a sort of a sham wedding. Um, but then the giant realizes that something is completely off because Thor eats everything. He has a gigantic appetite and he just eats everything. And the giant goes like, "How does this how does this woman, sorry, have such a big appetite?" And then, Thor reveals himself, takes the hammer and smashes the giant's head in. It's just absurd. This whole story is so humorous and absurd, which also sometimes is one of those stories that people don't expect from Old Norse mythology. Thor seeing being this sort of big burly man as is usually depicted, and he has not, just dresses up as a woman and to get his hammer back. It's a very humorous story. I think that's my favorite story, I would say. There's not much to learn from it, I have to say, but I just think it's humorous. And I think
Yeah,
humor is also very important.
no, you're right. That is a very funny story. And
Yeah.
earlier you were talking about Tolkien. And what I love about
Yes.
Tolkien and C.S. Lewis is that their works are telling a very Christian or Abrahamic story
Mhm.
through the pagan lens.
Very much. Yes.
If I'm not mistaken, Norse mythology and Christianity have both had an influence on each other. Am I correct in
Mhm.
saying that?
So influence, that's a question really, because I mean, at the when Scandinavia was Christianized, certainly, at the usually in the mythos, perhaps when they use the word myth here, in the myth of the origin of nations, right? This idea of how a country was created as a modern country in this case. If you look at the history books here in Norway, for example, they would say, well, Christianity started on this date, on this year. This is when the king made Norway Christian. And you have the same sort of stories coming from Scandinavia and from the rest of Scandinavia and also Iceland. In Iceland, Christianity came in the year 1000, and that's it. That's when Christianity came to Iceland. But, when you look at the history of it, really, you see that the Christianization was a bit more gradual, right? You see people becoming Christian in the ninth and 10th centuries, right? So the 8 and 900s. You see, graves with crosses in them from much earlier than the official Christianization of the country. So there certainly was a lot of contact coming in there and a lot of people becoming Christians. Perhaps one of the reasons that has been suggested, perhaps floated around, is the idea that especially richer people in Scandinavia, who were the ones who could afford to travel, right? They were the ones who could afford to travel to England and to what is today Germany and France and the rest of Europe. Um, they were the ones who were seeing Christianity, and they saw it as being the religion of the kings, right? It's a high status religion. It's what the kings and the nobles did in Europe. So it's almost like a status symbol to become a Christian, perhaps early on. So that is certainly there. What we do see is that there was at least some period of time when there were both Christianity and Old Norse religion sort of coexisting to a certain extent. So we see there's a famous artifact from Denmark. I believe it's from Denmark, yes, which is a mold for a smith, where so to pour molten metal in, right, to create something, which has both a Thor's hammer and a cross on it. So he was mass producing crosses and Thor's hammers because, well, there's a market for both. So you see this sort of society that is perhaps in between moving from Old Norse to Christianity. What the influence perhaps what could be seen is that there is perhaps some evidence that maybe early on some pagans would have seen Jesus or God as just another one of the gods. Maybe they just started integrating Jesus into the pantheon of gods before
I've
eventually, of
always
course,
wondered that
becoming fully
about the
Christian.
Greeks. When Greece was being
Yeah,
Christianized,
right.
I wonder if they took Jesus in the pantheon. I wonder.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. I'm not sure with the Greeks, I'll be honest, because that is. quite a hole in my knowledge when it comes to that's way too old for my scholarship, right? But with Scandinavia, there seems to have been at least a bit of that. And also there's suggestions, which again is debated in the scholarship, whether the use of Thor's hammers as pendants, which we found many of in the archaeological record, whether that was a response to Christians wearing crosses. It wasn't perhaps something that was done normally, but Christians then were walking around with cross pendants around and said, well, we'll have something of our own. And they made Thor's hammers as pendants. So there's a suggestion, perhaps I'm not an archaeologist, but I wonder perhaps whether it's the archaeological record showing them quite late, perhaps with the pendants. So that sort of matches with early Christianity coming in. So there's that element of influence. When it comes to pagan influence on Christianity, I tend to be a bit more careful with that. And the reason I say that is how much of it can you say is religious and how much of it is cultural, right? Whether some cultural norms that would have been associated with paganism just survived in the culture and has been integrated into Christianity, right? So you get this with a lot of imagery and a lot of elements that would be seen as pagan, but in reality, it's just a cultural norm that people just did anyway, and just kept them and became part of the body of Christian belief or Christian festivities, perhaps, right? With Christmas, for example, certain elements in Christmas that have very little to do with the birth of Jesus, right? There's no reason to have a Christmas tree, you know. But it seems to be cultural elements that have been integrated. People just kept on doing them. And then it has been accepted by Christianity as being perhaps harmless. Some things could be seen as harmful, as in, they're pagan. They wouldn't be acceptable in a Christian society. But some things might have just been integrated from culture. So how much of the influence is there, as in how much it has influenced Christianity? That's a bigger question. Also because, as you know, Christianity, especially in the Middle Ages, so more than anything, it's a very centralized religion, right? It's a religion that has a central power and central the rules and the belief system is written by Rome, and that is what the religion is. So it's a bit harder perhaps for somewhere like Scandinavia, which is so peripheral, to have any influence perhaps on Rome. That would be a bit, it's hubris perhaps to think so. But certain cultural norms certainly they would have remained, and you could maybe see some elements here and there. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, we say hell, and that comes from
Mm,
Norse, hell.
mm,
But
absolutely.
in the Norse tradition, hell is a cold abode. And in
Yes.
Christian and even Muslim traditions, it's hot. It's like an
Yes.
oven. What is the
Yes.
correlation there? Is
That
there one?
is, yeah, that is an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, I wouldn't know. I generally don't cannot say why the reason for that would be, but I would also say I would wonder. I'm Mediterranean myself. Um, the heat when it gets too much, it can get a bit too much. It's not pleasant when it's too hot. So I can understand that something is that being super hot, and there perhaps would be hell. Whereas somewhere like here that is very cold here up here in Norway, you would expect an eternal winter to be the definition of hell, perhaps. So I wonder if that plays a part into it because certainly here you see it and people, now it's getting into winter. We started getting frost over here, even though it's still October. Um, but people are bracing for a winter, and then by March and April, people are like, "Well, we're done with winter. We just want some sun now." So you can imagine the concept of an eternal winter to be the definition of hell itself. So
Yeah.
yeah, I wonder if that sort of plays a part into it, doesn't it?
Yeah, I always found that concept to be very fascinating. That being said, what do you know
Hmm.
about the Norse tradition having an influence on the Islamic tradition and vice versa?
Right,
Is there any evidence to suggest
right,
that?
right. So what I can say here is that this is sort of my area. This is my main area of study as a scholar. I focus perhaps on the connection between the Islamic world and medieval Scandinavia, right? So that is what I'm interested in, looking both at Old Norse literature when it's they write and speak about Islam and Muslims, but also Arabic literature when they write about Scandinavians and Vikings, especially in that case, in the Viking Age. Um, well, when it comes to influence on each other, you couldn't really see that so much. You have to keep in mind, of course, that they were on opposite ends of the continent, really, and also on different continents to a certain extent. But considering that Spain, the majority of Spain was Muslim at this point in time, it would physically be on the other side of the same continent. That yeah, the influence perhaps is not a good way of putting it. I would say there was a lot of connection and a lot of communication, perhaps, and encounters. There certainly was that. We do not have any evidence, I would say, that any of them would have been influenced by Islam to a certain extent, as in integrating certain parts of the culture into Scandinavian culture. We do have elements. We do have, for example, rings. There is one ring that was found a few years ago that has Allah written on it. But that seems to be more a product of trade, perhaps, right? It's just a beautiful ring that would have been traded in or bought on their travels. But we do know, of course, Vikings, they're the Scandinavians rather generally, very well known for their travels. They traveled a lot. They traveled everywhere. So yes, they did travel to places which were Muslim and where Muslims lived. So, uh, for, in many parts of the world, in fact, they would have gone not only to Spain, as I said, the majority of Spain at this point in the Middle Ages would have been Muslim, Al-Andalus, which was basically, well, I would say the southern part of Spain, but in reality, it's only a small portion of the north that was Christian in reality. The vast majority was Muslim. But also in North Africa, they traveled in the Mediterranean and also in the Middle East. Especially thinking of Scandinavians being part of the Varangian Guard. So the Varangian Guard were uh, hired, you would say, no, mercenaries, really, guards that worked in the Byzantine army in Istanbul, well, at the time Constantinople. Um, and they would have had either interactions with Muslims around the Middle East, but also, of course, fighting against them, right? So this is the Byzantines would have also fought Muslims in the region and in the Mediterranean at this point in time. So we do have evidence of that happening. We do have evidence of that encounter happening. So we have a lot of that, certainly.
Yeah. No evidence to suggest that Muslim tradition, though, influenced Norse mythology as we know it today.
No, that would not that we do not have any evidence of that. No, we do not. We cannot say that we do have evidence. But they did. What we can say, what I can say for sure, is that they certainly had opinions about each other. That is something that we certainly know, and they had very strong opinions about each other,
Yeah.
which is fascinating for me because there's from both sides, right? You see from both Arabic, like literature written in Arabic and also literature written in Old Norse, where they certainly had opinions about each other, and they made it very clear.
Yeah. And I'm sure you might be familiar with this, but just the concept of like, you know, I heard, I don't know how true this is, but Gungnir,
Mm,
the spear of Odin,
yeah.
apparently if you spell
Yes.
it backwards, it comes
Mm,
out to be the spear of the Quran. That's a way to interpret it. Which
mm,
I don't know if that's
right.
all made up or not, but I've heard that before.
Yeah.
I thought that was a fascinating connection.
Right. Right.
Have you heard
It's
that
interesting. What
before?
I find interesting, I have not heard of that before, actually. No. Um, what it is, it's interesting. Of course, it's. I mean, I would be very suspicious, not suspicious, but perhaps uh, I wouldn't say that that would have been the case, honestly.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's it's I find it fascinating to a certain extent how the how much there wants to be a connection. Someone wants to have a
Yeah.
connection to it.
Yeah.
It's which I find fascinating, honestly. Also because when you speak of Islamic culture, it's so rich and has such a long history that I don't think it needs embellishment, perhaps, with Old Norse mythology. I think it can stand on its own, certainly.
No, yeah, you're right.
So yeah, I
Yeah.
find that fascinating, you know.
Yeah, I will admit I don't meet too many people like myself who are enthusiasts of the North culture or the Norse
Mm,
culture from my background, you know. But I do find it
sure.
fascinating, and that leads me to my next question. We know that the Vikings had contact with Christians. We know the
Mm,
Vikings had contact with Muslims. What do we know
yeah.
about Vikings coming into contact with Jews?
It's a very good question. So it is, there's a whole doctoral thesis that was written by a friend and colleague called Richard Cole, who wrote his thesis specifically about Jews in Old Norse literature, right? And what is fascinating from one of the things that comes out from it is the distinct lack of Jews in Old Norse literature.
Hmm.
He actually makes this as a theme, really, in his thesis, that there is a distinct lack of Jews in Old Norse literature, compared to, for example, the amount of Muslims that are mentioned or the frequency of Muslims mentioned in Old Norse literature. But otherwise, the amount of Jews is very little. Um, there would have been certainly, I mean, if they would have come across Muslims, especially in Al-Andalus, so Spain, there is no reason to reject the idea that they would have also met Jews there, because especially Al-Andalus was very much a multicultural society. Well, most of the Islamic world definitely it was, especially Mediterranean, like Spain and Sicily as well, which was very multicultural. And at that point in time, 9th century, 10th century, there would have been not only a large community of Jews living in Sevilla, for example, or Cordoba, which were sort of the power centers of Al-Andalus, but they were part of the courts. They were part of the emirs group of people. They were known for being translators. For example, the Jews were known for being very good for translating because they would have known multiple languages. They would have known the local Spanish dialect, or what would have been Old Spanish, but also Arabic and Hebrew, of course, and so they were very well known for that. So they were very well integrated and very well integrated, part and parcel of the culture itself. So they would have certainly come across Jews through their travels, but we do have a distinct lack of mentions of Jews in the literature, which is fascinating. I have to say, the Richard Cole thesis is a really fascinating look at this. Um, a lot of it tends to be through translation. So they would have translated literature from Latin. Of course, this is post-Christianity, post-Christianization, uh, that would have mentioned them there. But there was a distinct lack of knowledge of meeting, perhaps, or interacting compared to Muslims.
Yeah, that's something I've
Which, of course, you
wondered.
have to keep in mind. Of course, with Muslims, there would have been whole countries, well, not kingdoms, emirates and caliphates that would have been majority Muslim. So, they were interested in who's leading that place.
Hmm.
Whereas, of course, Jews would not have had their own sort of polity, their own country that they are running right at this time.
Hmm.
So it wouldn't have it would have been perhaps a footnote almost in their journey. Generally speaking, have to keep in mind as well that people who are writing or people who are writing themselves usually are, higher society, but also they're writing about people in the higher society. They don't really care about the normal peasant, right? They don't really care about, just the normal person. They're writing about kings, they're writing about, noble people, about heroes, and so a lot of the interaction that you're getting in these texts is also between people of higher standing. So that would make sense that if they're traveling to other places, they're meeting the leaders of those places, they're meeting the noble people from those places. So yes, if they're going to an Islamic land, generally they're going to interact with, the leaders of those countries, which would have been, of course, Muslim. So it's a very interesting. It's a very interesting uh, lack, perhaps, of Jews in the literature, which is yeah, fascinating.
Yeah, that is fascinating to me. And it makes me wonder, Hindus wouldn't be called pagans necessarily,
Mm,
but is there any evidence to suggest that the Vikings encountered other people who also worshipped pantheons?
mm. Yes, they certainly would have with with Slavic people.
Hmm.
Certainly, because and especially with Vikings, because one thing that's I would have to sort of make a point here, which is important, I think, is the fact that when it comes to the literature itself that we have, well, I would say the vast majority, I would say all the literature really, I could quite comfortably say all of it, that it comes post-Christianity, right? It's post-Christianization of
Yeah,
Scandinavia because the whole concept of writing in a book, for example, the whole technology of writing in a book, which is wild for us today to think of it as a technology, but it is the technology of writing in a book is something that came in with Christianity, right? That concept wasn't quite a thing pre-Christianization. So we do have some runic inscriptions, we do have some rune stones and some other smaller runic inscriptions, but when it comes to writing long texts and long chronicles, that is something that came with Christianity. So a lot of that is going to be either filtered through a Christian lens, if it's covering periods before the Christianization, or it's going to be texts from the Christian era, right? So, or stories from the Christian era. So a lot of what we have really would have been from the 11th century onwards, let's say 1000s onwards, with the vast majority then coming into the 1200s and 1300s, right? That's where there's a boom of literature, boom of writing. So that's really what we can point at and say what happened, more than what happened in the Viking Age proper. At least through a literary point of view. But yeah, certainly there would have been encounters with Slavic peoples who were also Christianized relatively late. But also other people in Europe, the Magyars, for example, were basically Hungarians in modern grouping. But yeah, there would, and we do know that they traveled all the way through the Volga, for example, right? We do know that they traveled the Volga River, so through what today is Russia and into what today is Ukraine. We do know that they traveled through there, so it would have been inevitable that they would have met other pagans there, certainly. But yes, again, it's something that we don't see as much because the literature itself is so late, right?
yeah,
But they would have certainly you know they would have been pagans as well. The Samis in the north of
yeah,
Scandinavia, so
that's
the
true.
Sami group, the indigenous peoples of Scandinavia, um, they would have been pagan as well, and quite late as well. They were
Yeah,
Christianized later on, but they seem to be sort of a holdover as well of paganism even after Christianization. So they would have also met those, certainly. Oh, well, they would have lived with them. I mean, they're just there. They're there. They
that's
were just
true.
up north mostly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I like how you bring up the literature because in the Hindu tradition, Ganesh, he wrote the Bhagavad Gita with his tusk.
Hmm.
Odin is the source of the Havamal. But how
Hmm.
is the Havamal still preserved? How do we have that if a lot of the literature of
Yeah.
the Norse tradition is post Christianity?
Right. So, the question of when the poetry itself was composed is an ongoing and probably eternal um, debate in the scholarship, right? Because one thing that's why poetry tends to be preserved for a long time as well, is that poetry has structure, right? Poetry has linguistic and um, rhythmical structure that follow very strict rules, right? This is a very common thing in poetry in general. You have to have as many syllables, and then it has to rhyme here and there. There's very strict rules. So that structure is very hard to break. So it's very hard. It's a much easier way, or perhaps it's a more secure way of preserving knowledge.
Mhm.
Because if you change anything and if you don't do it well, you're going to break the whole structure of the poem, which breaks apart, right? So poetry tends to be very useful for sort of preservation of knowledge because people can learn it. And people sort of that has its rhythm and it works. The rhythm works. Its rules work. It's the rhyming works, and it's easier to remember, right? And it's something that seems to have been used all over the world. It's an idea that the use of poetry is a very useful method, is a very useful tool for preservation of knowledge. And that is one of the reasons we have a lot of these older poems, is that they were preserved in memory and in oral tradition. They were recited over and over, and the people learned them and they did it over multiple generations until some people decided maybe we should write it down. Maybe we should have it written down, and then we have a written version of it. So that seems what has happened there. There's a move over from oral traditions into written traditions. And poetry is sort of this very, very rife for preserving structure. So yes, there are it's sort of that's why it remains, right? It's very useful.
Yeah. So that being said, did a written version of the Havamal exist before Snorri Sturluson or around his time
Uh,
after?
Not really. What the only sources that we have is yes, the poetic and the prose Edda, as they're called.
Mhm.
So the poetic Edda is the manuscripts that we have that only preserve the poetry itself, and the prose Edda is what Snorri would have done, Snorri Sturluson, where he not only did the poetry, but he wrote about the poetry. He wrote
Mhm.
about what is happening in the poetry and sort of like fleshing it out, perhaps. Uh, the question that seems to be raised is how much Snorri would have taken the poetry from oral tradition himself. So maybe he went around and asked people, or maybe he knew them himself, or how much maybe he had a collection of poetry himself written down already, as whether he had a copy himself. That is also a question that can be raised. And unfortunately, one of the issues that we have with the manuscript tradition itself is that we do not, well, I cannot think of any case of the original manuscript surviving. They're all copies of copies of copies, right? So it's really hard to ascertain whether we do have the manuscripts that have the poetic Edda, so the collection of poems, but they are late. They're much later. They are copies of copies of copies of copies. What was very common at the time. This was long before the printing press. So yeah, so it's really hard to ascertain whether there were copies known at the time of Snorri and whether he was referring to any printed material or not printed, written material himself. But certainly it could have been the case that it was known. It wasn't perhaps the first to refer to. I'll just well, let me see. Let's make sure. Because yeah, exactly. So that's it. Because at around the same time, just wanted to check the dates just to make sure that I don't say something false. But around the same date, just around Snorre, there was also someone in Denmark called Snorre, called Saxo Grammaticus,
Hmm.
was also making references and also translating to Old Norse in some cases. Sorry,
Wow.
translating to Latin, perhaps. Sorry, translating some of the poetry to Latin, and it would have been around the same time. That's what I needed to check. Just before Snorri. Um, so they're certainly known in the region, certainly. But yeah, it's very yeah. It seems to be at least that it was part of the collective memory of the culture, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I could
Uh,
see that. I wanted to say, Carl, I'd love to continue this conversation. Do you still have time?
mhm. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
So it'll be the same link because this one's going to end in just 3 minutes. If you could just hop onto the same
Okay.
link, I'll see you there.
Yeah, sure,
Okay.
sure.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I imagine you might be familiar with this as well, but I think it's fascinating that Ferdowsi,
Hmm.
this was, the post-Islamization of Persia.
Hmm.
He decided to
Hmm.
compile the Book of Kings, the Shahnameh, and it
Sure.
collects the myths and the stories of old
Hmm.
Iran. And it took him, I think, about like 30 to 35 years or so. Do we know how long it took Snorri Sturluson to compose the prose and the poetic?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I don't think we do know exactly because the thing is that we do know relatively little about Snorri's life, I have to say. We do have details of what he did and what he was, but we do have very little details, I would say. But no, I wouldn't know how long it would have taken him, but it seems at least to have been, over a long period of time. Whether he did it full time, is another question. Maybe it's something that he did over time and because it seems that he was also very interested in what we could refer to as antiquarianism, like he was interested in the old history. So it's clearly, he was not only interested in his own, again, in the history of in of Norse mythology, but he was also interested in the history of kings. He's also attributed the authorship of what's called the Heimskringla, which is this collection of the histories of the kings of Norway. So he also has attributed this text. So it seems that he was very much interested in in this history of his own culture, you can say, but he's Icelandic, but certainly about the older times in Norway as well, right? Before before the settlement of Iceland and into the settlement of Iceland eventually. But no, he was certainly interested in the antiquarianism. So it seems that it was a big part of his life to collect the stories and then compile them. But I wouldn't be able to tell you how long it would taken him to do it. And one other thing that we have to keep in mind with Snorre, because sometimes Snorre is presented as this person who was just interested in mythology and he was interested in perhaps preserving the mythology, but he had other purposes to write the Edda, really. And because he was very interested in poetry, that was his main issue. His main interest is poetry. He was very interested in poetry. But poetry, like Old Norse poetry especially, has this literary literary device called kenning. So a kenning is this literary device that is used in poetry to refer to something by making similes, right? So the idea of like, the tree of battle, for example, is a man. Just instead of saying man, you say tree of battle, for example. So there's a lot of this of this and this of that. Um, and so a lot of those kennings made references to mythology. So they would have said, the fire of Fafnir, whatever, that means gold, right? But
That's a good
if you
one.
are not familiar
Those
with
are both good
mythology,
ones.
the whole story, the whole poetry falls apart because you have no idea what they're talking about,
Yeah.
right?
It's like a secret code.
So it is almost, right?
Yeah.
But of course, the suggestion is that people who were pagan before, before the Christianization, they would have known these stories anyway. They know what they're talking about. But that got lost over time with Christianization. So it seems that what Snorri was trying to do here, and certainly that was the purpose of the Prose Edda, is that he was trying to preserve these details for him to understand, or for not for others to understand the poetry. Right?
Mm.
It was a way of an educational book. It was a school book essentially, right? Because
Wow.
if you look at other parts of the Edda, yes, we do sort of focus on the first part about mythology, but then the second part of the book is actually about poetic meters. It's going technically into poetic meter. You need to have this much syllables, and you have to do this. So it's clearly a book about poetry more than it is a book about mythology. The mythology is just needed for you to understand or compose new ones if you want to compose new poems, so that you can sort of use these ideas and understand what they're referring to when they're making this very obscure reference to some goddess or some god somewhere. You have to know the story of why that is there, you know. So that's one issue. That's
Absolutely.
one thing that needs to be, I think, kept in mind that he was doing it for a purpose, not just for the love of it.
That's insightful. Thanks for sharing that. And
Yeah.
from the way it's always been portrayed to me, at least, it seems like, especially in those medieval days, where Christianity tried really hard to stomp out paganism, and the Scandinavian
Hmm.
countries were rather resistant. But eventually, it happened. But these stories, we still have them, and there's people today
Hmm.
who are pagan again. And so I wonder
Yeah.
how, over the last millennia, has this been able to have been preserved in such a way that I feel like is very different from anywhere else in the world? I mean, were there
Hmm.
secret societies or groups of crypto pagans across the history
Hmm.
of Scandinavian countries? Like, how is it a thing? How is it so strong still?
So I don't think that you could say that there were some crypto pagans that remained. What did happen, however, is that in the 18th century, well, 17th and 18th centuries, there was an increase in people, in scholars, even like this sort of this era of like the Enlightenment, eventually like what eventually became Enlightenment and all that, um, where they were just interested in history and interested in the scholarship of the literature itself, and they were rediscovering these manuscripts.
Mm.
That there were some people who were interested in this stash of literature that had been essentially ignored for centuries, and they were just interested in this. So one of the most important names that we have is Árni Magnússon, um, which who was a collector of manuscripts, and he did a lot of scholarship and collected the manuscripts. And in fact, the two libraries that we have, one in Iceland and one in Denmark, that have the vast majority of the manuscripts today are named after him.
Mm.
The Arne Magnaean Library in Denmark and the Arne Magnussonar in Iceland. So, he was a very important figure in there that he started collecting these manuscripts and working on them, sort of, even others then as well started copying them out and publishing books based on these manuscripts and all that. So there was an increase in scholarship there. So that's certainly one way that it became popularized again. But then, of course, in the 19th century, which is there was a movement throughout Europe. I'm not sure about the rest of the world, but certainly about in Europe. There was a wave of romanticism, right? National romanticism, as it was called. There was a move towards this exaltation, perhaps, of your own culture and history, right? So you see this with music, you see this with literature, with paintings. You see, a lot of the national romantic paintings that you see in galleries all over Europe, and in the US, I'm sure, there's and art galleries there, where you see these paintings that romanticize, literally that's the use of the word national romantic, will romanticize their countries and their histories, right? Through landscapes, for example, or through cultural images. And that certainly happened in Scandinavia, where you get a lot of this huge interest in this antiquarian background, this old past time of Scandinavia. And of course, I mean, yeah, well, if I say this to Norwegians, perhaps they might disagree with me, but that there was also this, not perhaps inferiority complex, almost, not really. I mean, I'm exaggerating it here, but there was perhaps a bit of inferiority complex to a certain extent that, these Scandinavian countries that are on the periphery of Europe, periphery of the world almost, up there in the north. Hey, we also have our own mythology, like the Greeks and the Romans did, right? There's that whole, the Greek and the Roman mythology, which exploded again with the Renaissance, and that's remained over the centuries. Then the Scandinavians came, oh, look, we have our own thing. We have our own pagan mythology. We have our own stories, and they really pushed that forward, right? To
Mm.
put it on the same foothold as the Mediterranean world, uh, which had more prestige, perhaps you could say. But yeah, so that's one issue one thing that happened there, that they sort of start pushing their own history. And you see this with Wagner, for example. Yes, he's German, but it's with general Germanic culture, right? That was the idea. With Wagner doing the Nibelungen lead, the opera about the Nibelung. So yeah, so there was a movement for this, and that became popularized throughout this period. There were certainly in the 19th century onwards as well. There were movements. 19th century was very big on esoteric traditions. There were a lot of groups popping up doing like some very strange things with esoteric movements and magic and all of that. These esoteric sects and groups, and some of which started incorporating a lot of the pagan mythology from the north as well. And that seems to be the start of these neo-pagan movements late into the 19th century and then early 20th century, and then eventually started getting blended in with the hippie culture of the 60s and 70s. It became their own movement. And then you have what you have today, essentially. Unfortunately, a lot of it, especially even in the original explosion of neo-pagan movements in the 19th century, a lot of it was very racist, unfortunately. A lot of it was very much integrated with racist ideology and anti-Semitic ideology, the idea of Christianity being an invading culture into Europe. So therefore, we have to go back to our roots because it's a Judeo-Christian culture, right? So it's very blended into anti-Semitism and racism, which some of which still exists today, I'm have to say, within neo-pagan movements. But of course, it would be unfair to say that all neo-pagans are racist because that's certainly not the truth. Um, Unfortunately, the racist ones tend to be the loudest, as they always tend to be, unfortunately. So they tend to be the one that gets most attention. But they are not representative, certainly, of neo-pagans everywhere. I have to say that because that's
Yeah,
very
true.
unfair for on those who have very good intentions.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're right. And thanks for sharing all that. And it made me think of a couple of things. One of them being uh, Soren Kierkegaard. He was
Mm,
alive in that time that you're talking about. You're referring to when the
yes.
interest was coming back. And I remember reading somewhere that in his youth he was very fascinated by these myths before
Mm,
he sort of
mm,
shifted to theology and stuff like that.
sure.
Um, Another thing I remember I came across a few years ago was Carl Jung. He was writing something about Nietzsche. And I don't know if you're familiar with Nietzsche's idea of Apollonian and Dionysian,
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
there's a claim that when Nietzsche was young, he was in a forest somewhere and he
Sure.
encountered a person and it
Mm.
freaked him out. And that to him was Dionysus. But Carl Jung says
Oh, okay.
actually who he encountered was Odin, the figure of Odin. And I
Mm.
thought that was very interesting because I've also heard claims that the figure of Odin comes from the East. He was like an Eastern
Mm.
mythological figure that somehow found his way into
Mm.
Scandinavia. So those were just some things I was thinking about what you were saying.
Sure.
I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
So what I can say, especially what you say now about the Eastern character coming into Scandinavia, that is so that's something that Snorre suggested, right?
Mm.
So Snorri Sturluson. So just to make sure, because it's for anyone hearing, sometimes I would say Snorre because that's how we would say it in Norway. That's the Norwegian version of the name Snorre. It's Snorri in Icelandic. So I might use the two interchangeably. But what Snorre did, especially in Heimskringla, which is that collection of kings biographies, and also in the Edda, in the Prose Edda, and the introduction to the Prose Edda, he suggests, and very much based on trends in Europe at this time, that the gods were actually humans originally. So this idea is called euhemerism, right? It's the humoristic view of religion, the idea that the gods themselves have roots in real humans who have been deified later on, right? Um, so he has this idea that they were actually humans who came from Troy,
Yeah.
bizarrely enough. But
Interesting,
so,
right?
so to us, it is very bizarre nowadays, right? Because they were actually in the Battle of Troy, and some of them left, and then they moved over north, and they settled in Sweden, and then one of them was called Odin, and the other one was called Thor, and so there's a whole story going on there, and as they did, as they were very big fans of in the Middle Ages, they really try to make connections with words and etymologies of words, right? Which gave rise to these sort of folk etymologies, or these etymologies that are not quite true. It's just based on the fact that they sound roughly the same. But so what he suggested is that that's why the gods are called the Aesir. It's because they're Asian. Right? So that's the connection that he made in his mind that, oh, Asia, Asian, Aesir, that's why. Um, and of course, we do not have any evidence. And we do know that was a very common trend in this period of time of trying to make your own origin story and point it back to learned literature, right? Because
Yeah.
the stories of Troy would have been part of the school literature, essentially, of those who
Yeah.
were
And not
rich
only
enough,
that, but
perhaps,
it's
to
also
have literature.
a claim to Rome, because Rome
It
comes
is.
from Troy, and Rome is
Exactly.
considered the paragon of glory in a lot of European history.
Yes, exactly. So they sort of wrote themselves into world history, right? That's what
Yeah,
they
it's
try to
interesting how
do. Like
humans do that.
everyone that yeah, right, exactly. So wait, we're important too, you see. So we obviously are the same as everyone else. We also came from Troy, which is a common thing, right? This is something that you see even in England, for example, right? In England, you have this text, Histori Britannum, the history of Britain or the kings of Britain by Geoffrey of Monmouth, who did the same thing, really. Not with the gods, however. What he said is that there was someone from Troy called Brutus who settled England, and that's why it's called Britain, right? Because Brutus, Britain. Sure. So that is the same sort of connection being made that Snorri did with Troy, with the Trojans and Asia. So it is a very common trend at this time. So I wouldn't put too much credence into that story. Certainly, it was part of the trend, and that's something that I also tell my students when I teach at the university, is that you have to keep in mind oftentimes that the texts that we have oftentimes say more about who's writing them than what's written in them, right? So even though they're histories of, maybe stories of the gods and maybe of ancient kings of old, times, oftentimes those texts tell us more about who's writing them rather than what's the content of the text themselves. It tells us
Very
more
true.
about the mindset, perhaps, or the cultural setting of whoever is writing them. And what's not is the same, right? It says more about the fact that it was written in the 1220s and 1230s than it does about, ninth century Scandinavia to a certain
Yeah,
extent. So
you're
that is
you're
something that's
absolutely
also
right.
we also have to keep it in mind.
Yeah, no, I'm a
Yeah,
writer. I can attest to that. You're absolutely right.
yeah,
And
right.
there's another thing. I was 18 when I went on this tour in Turkey, and my tour guide,
Mm,
he cautioned us
mm,
about the credence of this case, but he said there's a theory out there that the Scandinavians are a lost, or sorry, I think it's the other way around. The Turks are a lost tribe of the Scandinavians. Is there any
right,
correlation?
right. No, I don't think that that would be that certainly not. I mean, I think it's this. I wouldn't say that there's any historicity to it, but I find it fascinating anyway that it's the same sort of mindset that Snorri was working with in this case, right? There's this also almost yearning to make a connection with somewhere far away and somewhere exotic. So it's I find it fascinating from that point of view that maybe some are still doing that same idea, but from a modern perspective, that they are still trying to say, like, oh, we come from these people. And you see this a lot, we see that a lot with, especially with countries that are colonized countries, I would say. Australia and the US, for example, where a lot of people really want to have a connection to their origins, which sometimes comes across as a bit, well, not bizarre, but it's something that a lot of us in Europe perhaps see as a bit too much oftentimes. But this which is perfectly legitimate, I would say. With Americans saying like, well, I'm Irish American. This
Yeah.
yearning for connection to the origins of where you're from, which again is perfectly legitimate. Um, but it's almost like a base human thing to want, right? This connecting to perhaps a greater past, to something important from the past, and you see it with even people here, right? It's not just with Americans and Australians, to be fair, but here you would say, oh, I'm a descendant of a king. Like, well, I can guarantee that probably 90% of the population is, but sure. But, you know, to be
Yeah.
fair, especially going back centuries and centuries, if you count the amount of ancestors that you have over a period of 20 generations, you get into tens of thousands of people. So, you
Yeah.
know,
A very good point.
uh,
Was I right, by the way, about that? Was it that is the claim that the Turks come from the Scandinavians or the Scandinavians from the Turks? Are you familiar with the claim?
so the Trojans thing, sure, certainly. So what I said, like with Scandinavia, this idea that they came from Troy,
Okay.
and yeah, they were very familiar that Troy was in Turkey. Snorri even says that quite explicitly. Says, Troy, what we today call Turkey, Turkey.
Okay.
So
Okay.
he makes that connection quite explicitly there. The other way around, I've never heard it. I must say, this is the first time I'm hearing that
He was a
that.
he was a Swedish scholar. I'm forgetting his name,
Hmm,
but I think it was him. He was trying. It could have been that the Scandinavians were a lost tribe of the Turks in the steppes, not like Anatolia itself,
hmm,
but the Turks in the steppes. But again, as you said,
hmm.
people were trying to make connections everywhere. One thing I will point out,
Yeah,
though,
yeah.
that I find fascinating is the resemblance in the mythologies. In the Norse mythologies, in the Turkic and Mongolian mythologies,
Hmm,
the significance of the wolf. In Norse, it's the devourer, the
interesting.
great devourer.
Yes,
But
yes, yes.
over in the East, it's like a guide, almost like a new life giver, bringing you into some new world.
Hmm. That's very interesting. Yes, I mean, I have to say my knowledge of Turkic and Mongolian mythology is, I would say, zero. So I cannot really comment on that. But it is interesting. Yeah, there's a lot of commonalities that get pointed out oftentimes with not just linguistically but also culturally. And there's this question oftentimes, which I don't think it would be relevant really for Turkic and Mongolian in this case, with um, this line of reasoning, is how much of it can be traced back to sort of Indo-European cultures, right? This idea of, Indo-European cultures would have been the original culture, perhaps you could say, from where a lot of the languages came out, and it's mainly a linguistic term, Indo-European, like Proto-Indo-European, which is this hypothetical language from which a lot of languages descended, right? And it is this proto-language. It's probably somewhere in the steppes and in Anatolia and around that region, which have been suggested as the origins of it. But it's the one language from which Germanic languages, Latin languages, Greek, Iranian languages, and also Indian languages came out of, right? They're all sort of one big family of languages that sort of split tens of thousands of years ago and then sort of became their own thing. But there's a lot of connection there. So there have been efforts by some people and some scholars that try to trace any commonalities in culture to that one culture originally, and how much of this is a holdover from that, right? So there has been that. I mean, as I said, mostly this is a linguistic grouping more than a cultural grouping. So, there are also pushback in some cases of attributing any cultural aspects to it. But certainly there's even traces in the language, right? That would show at least some mythological or religious knowledge.
Hmm.
The fact that, for example, I'm trying to remember how it was. Uh, but the word Deus, the word that we have
Ah,
Deus for God in Latin, it goes back, it's the same root as Zeus in
yeah.
Greek. and it's all related to having a god of the sky. That's the idea. The original meaning would have been god of the sky or sky god or something along those lines. And Jupiter is also the same root, which in this case would mean Jove, which is related to Jove, Pater, so Father Jove, Father Zeus, essentially. Um, so there's all of these ideas. So maybe, okay, there must have been some sort of sky god, maybe in Proto-European culture or Proto-Indo-European culture that sort of permeated everywhere eventually. But it's really hard to pinpoint, I have to say. It's hypotheticals, a lot of hypotheticals. I mean, learned hypotheticals to be fair, and informed hypotheticals. Um, but it's yeah, I personally would be a bit wary of attributing any commonalities to that. Um, but there certainly are common human traits, I would say, and that sometimes I think a lot of people sort of dismiss that. But I was having a conversation relatively recently about the popularity of flood myths in the world, right? This idea of a flood, like destroying or just some sort of cataclysmic event that has to do with flooding. Shows up in Americas, like in Mesoamerican culture. It shows up in the Middle East, of course, with Noah and Gilgamesh, but it shows up a bit everywhere. And it's like, well, maybe there's a connection culturally there. That's why these stories are so common. There's influence. But then the counter argument is that a lot of cultures tend to settle by the seashore. So the idea of a cataclysmic sea-related event is always there. So it's just a normal human fear that maybe a huge wave would destroy their culture or destroy their city because they just live by the sea. So it's a common fear that anyone would have. So it's not necessarily a sign of connection. It's a sign of just being human, oftentimes.
Yeah, no, you are right about that. Yeah, it's interesting, and it goes back to what you were saying, like this yearning to want to make connections cross culturally. It's a
Mm,
very human
yes,
desire. I'm curious about
it
you,
really is.
Karl.
Yes.
How did you get
Mm,
interested in all this stuff? Especially your scholarship. What is it about the Muslim world and the connections you can make with
mm.
that fascinates you?
So in my case personally, so a bit of background about me, I have to say. So I am originally from, or originally I am from Malta. So Malta, for those who don't know, it's a very small country, so it's legitimate to not know about it. It's a tiny little country, an island between Sicily and Libya, or Sicily and Tunisia. Because it's little tiny island. We're our own country. We're a republic. But that is my background that has informed sort of my interests to a certain extent. Certainly not the interest about Norse mythology and medieval Scandinavia, because that's on the literal opposite end of the continent. That was something that I was interested in personally, through my travels, and I had come to Norway often for a holiday, and I just wanted to do it full time. And but my background sort of seeped in to that because our language, the Maltese language, is a Semitic language that derives from Arabic. It's sort of like this dialect of Arabic that sort of split off Arabic, and then sort of evolved separately because then we became Christian, so we were sort of separated from the Islamic culture. So our language sort of evolved or developed independently. So that is part of that. So that also was an impetus for me to learn Arabic and sort of be able to read the Arabic literature about Vikings. And it's also part of my history, really. Malta was also Muslim for centuries, in the Middle Ages. That's why we still have the language. Would have been part of Sicily, essentially, and Sicily was Muslim as well at this point. So it's also part of my history to a certain extent. So it's something that fascinated me that there could be a connection between Scandinavia and the Mediterranean, which where I'm from, um, and especially with something that is linguistically close to my own linguistic background, right? So that's how it ended up becoming an interest in my scholarship. That I said, like, might as well use what I know already, just my language, my mother tongue, use that to learn Arabic, which is a smaller step than for most people, I guess, to learn Arabic from Maltese. and then use that as part of the whole picture of what I work with. And yeah, I mean, I started off working with mostly the Arabic literature, and then especially Andalusi literature about Vikings, about the Viking attacks in Spain, which happened very often. And then eventually I ended up doing the opposite side, right? Working with Old Norse literature about Muslims. So looking at the opposite end of the equation. So yeah, that's sort of why, yeah, that's how it became my career, I guess now.
Wow. Yeah, you mentioned you were Mediterranean earlier. I didn't know that. I would have thought you were just
Yes, yes, I am from
Norwegian,
Malta.
but I did notice your last
No,
name.
no,
It
no.
does sound a little Eastern,
Farrugia, yes.
Farrugia. Yeah.
So Farrugia is, yeah, for example, my surname is Farrugia. It's one of those surnames that is a mix of Arabic and Sicilian because it would have originally been Al Farruj, which is sort of still used, I guess, today, but it means a chicken, essentially. It's
Hmm.
another word for chicken. It's not the judge, but it's another word, or maybe a cock, you could say. But yeah, but that then became Italianized to Farrugia, and
Interesting.
it's written in an Italian orthography, in fact. So yeah, so Malta's a very mixed culture. It's a very weird in a good way, don't get me wrong, but a very weird culture that we still have. Even we have a lot of words in Maltese, especially religious words. Like for Catholic, Malta is very Catholic. It's a very Catholic country. Well over 90% are Catholic in Malta. But we have Islamic words that have been transferred over to Catholicism, essentially, to Christianity. So, for example, Easter in Maltese, it's Eid, just is Eid for Easter. And the 40-day period before Eid, before Easter, is Ramadan, which is Ramadan, essentially. So we kept the word Ramadan essentially for Lent, so we just transferred over uh, the word, the vocabulary, and plopped it onto Catholicism, which creates this very interesting mix of cultures. Yeah.
Yeah. No, the Maltese culture and history is very fascinating. I don't know if you know Tash
Yeah.
Sultana. She's a Maltese Australian
Oh yeah.
musician. She makes great
Oh yeah,
music.
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, Sultan is a
Yeah.
very, well, I wouldn't say common, but it's certainly a Maltese surname,
Yeah. Yeah,
Sultana. And
that's
that's of
interesting
course,
to know.
there's also, you have a politician in America, actually, in the US, that is Maltese. It's Pete Buttigieg. Buttigieg is a Maltese surname as well. He's Maltese. His
Oh,
father is Maltese.
interesting.
So he actually speaks Maltese, if I'm not mistaken. I've seen videos of him speaking Maltese. Pete Buttigieg. And yeah, Buttigieg is a very Maltese surname, actually, a very Maltese surname. Uh, which
Interesting.
is, Buttigieg, which comes from Arabic. I'm not sure that I'm not just ask me just to see how much I can explain. But do you speak Arabic? Do you understand Arabic at all?
Only in prayers.
Sure, sure, and absolutely. So Buttigieg actually just might be interesting because he's a, I guess, a big figure in American politics. But Buttigieg derives from Abu Tejej, which literally would mean the father of chickens. But what would have literally meant, what's really meant, would have been like a chicken farmer, right?
Interesting.
So it's Abu Tejej. So
Wow.
father. Yeah, so that's where Buttigieg comes from. That's yeah, very multi surname. Very multi surname.
That's good to know. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I really enjoyed this conversation with you, Carl. Everything you shared was
Can I
very
give you one
fascinating.
can you give one last snippet of information that I think you will find interesting?
Absolutely.
Uh, so you said we were talking about the influence and how much, there was knowledge about each other between Scandinavians and the Islamic world. There's one snippet that is really interesting. I find fascinating. There's this one text in Old Norse called Karl Magnus Saga, which is the saga of Charlemagne, right? And there's this one section that is translated from a Latin text. Most of the rest of it is translated from Old French. But there's this conversation that Roland, which is a famous sort of French hero in the Charlemagne stories, is speaking to a giant. And this giant is Saracen, right? He's referred to as Saracen. He's a Muslim character,
Harrison.
essentially.
Yeah.
But they're having a theological conversation about Islam and Christianity. And at one point, the giant declares something that sort of explains what he believes, what the Saracen, in inverted commas, religion is. And he mentions this one thing, and this has been translated to Old Norse. And it seems to be a paraphrase or almost a translation from the Quran, actually, which is from Surah Al-Ikhlas. So I think it's Surah 22, if I'm not mistaken. So Surah Al-Ikhlas. And it is in Latin, which was translated from Arabic to Latin, and then that was translated to Old Norse. So technically, I do have it here. So it would say in English, it would say, "We believe that the creator of the heaven and earth is one God, and he didn't have neither father nor son, and he had begotten no one, so he was not born of anyone, and he didn't have a son, or he didn't beget anyone, and he is just one God." And it seems to be a paraphrase of Surah Al-Ikhlas, which, if let me see, which is, let's see, yeah, exactly. لم يلد ولم يولد. So he didn't, he wasn't born and he didn't cause someone to get born, essentially. He didn't have any son. So that was, as I said, translated into Latin and eventually into Old Norse, which makes it quite possibly the only Old Norse translation of the Quran that we have,
Wow.
which exists. So it's one phrase from the Quran which has been translated to Old Norse, but it is one phrase. But I thought you might be interested in knowing that there is a line from the Quran in Old Norse that exists.
Incredible. Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. That's awesome. And um, real quick, is it okay if I finish with you on another session? Because I'm afraid this will just
Sure,
close up on us. Okay, same link again.
sure.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. That is very interesting to me. And I was going to ask you if you're familiar with this concept. I always thought it was fascinating. Even as a kid, Odin is one-eyed. And I don't know how familiar you
Hmm.
are, but in the Muslim tradition, the Antichrist, when he comes, he's also one-eyed.
Hmm.
Are you
Oh,
familiar with
really?
that?
Okay. No, I'm not actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's like, and here's
Interesting.
the even more interesting part. The name of the Antichrist is the Dajjal,
Hmm.
and the Dajjal
Good.
literally means the deceiver, and Odin is
Oh,
famed to be the deceiver. Isn't that a very
the
interesting
deceiver.
connection?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Very interesting. That's very interesting. I didn't know that. Yeah. Thank you. Should look into that. Yeah, I didn't know that. Uh, yeah, absolutely. That's interesting. It's very interesting.
yeah. Earlier, I had said to you, I don't know too many people like me who come from, a Pakistani Muslim background who have an
Sure.
interest in Norse tradition, but I was very fascinated by, what that looked like in history, and I'm a writer, as I mentioned. I wrote about Norse mythology, from a Muslim lens
Mhm.
in a way. It's its own story.
Sure.
And so yeah, it's something that I've always been passionate about. And so talking to you was a real treat. Like, thanks for being here.
Mm.
Thanks for sharing everything you shared.
My pleasure.
It was
My
cool.
pleasure. If you are interested in looking at another case of a Muslim character, perhaps Muslim, or at least in Arabic, certainly through that cultural lens, there was an author in the Middle Ages called At-Tartushi.
Hmm.
At-Tartushi means from Tortosa, essentially, which is in Spain. So he wrote, I mean, he's cited in other literature, but he wrote this eyewitness account that he had on his travels. He was a traveler and he traveled all over Europe. And he traveled to, supposedly at least, he mentions it by name, he travels to this place called Schleswig, which is in Denmark, or used to be in Denmark. Now it's part of Germany. But he goes there and he reports what he sees. So he actually sees Scandinavians, pagans, and he writes about them from a first-hand perspective. So it's really interesting to see that, even the vocabulary that he uses is very much influenced and through his own lens, right?
Hmm.
And it's something that he mentions that, for example, he mentions in him and there's another one called Ibn Fadlan, but
Yeah,
he
the
was from
13th warrior.
Baghdad.
Huh?
Yeah, exactly. But I believe it was At-Tartushi who mentions that they worshipped Sirius.
They worshipped what?
That is Sirius, the star Sirius.
Oh, okay, okay. The star.
But which we don't think really did happen. But it seems to have been more a way of for themselves. It's something that if I might be mistaken, but I believe it's something that pre-Islamic pagans did
Mm,
in the Arabian Peninsula. So that was their lens, his lens to speak about the pagan, because that's how he understood paganism. They worship the stars. So it was sort of like his way of saying that they were pagan. So it's sort of maybe interesting for you as well. Like this is someone who was writing through that lens when trying to explain what's happening with Old Norse mythology or the Norse religion at this point. So yeah, there's certainly a background, and I would say maybe that he would form part of that very old tradition as well, centuries old tradition of someone doing that through that lens. So yeah, no,
yeah, very cool. Thanks for sharing that, man. And
no problem.
yeah, it's nice to see, all the Norse stuff that's out there in the global culture today. You mentioned God of War
No,
earlier.
absolutely.
Like, wow, that was
Mm,
fantastic. Assassin's Creed Valhalla,
fantastic.
Vikings,
Yeah, yeah,
The
yeah,
Last Kingdom, Wardruna, the band. I mean, there's a
yeah.
lot.
Yeah,
There's
oh
a
yeah,
lot.
yeah, absolutely.
So it's really cool. And as I said, as much as I love Greek mythology, it's quite possible Norse mythology might be a little bit higher up. So
Yeah, yeah,
good
yeah.
stuff. Well,
It
thanks
is
again,
very
Carl,
cool.
for being here. Do you have any closing
Hey, my
thoughts?
pleasure.
Any final things you
No,
thought you might? Okay.
no, I would say that yeah, absolutely. Like, if you are interested in the connection, for anyone listening who was interested in this connection between the Islamic world and Scandinavia, I would encourage to read more about it. As I said, there's a lot of Arab, even literature in Arabic that mentions Vikings and mentions Scandinavians. Even though sometimes we think of the Middle Ages as being these islands of culture, where no one met each other, cannot be further from the truth. People traveled, people met each other, people wrote about each other. And yeah, there's a wealth of information there that is waiting there for people to learn. And it's lesser known than other stuff, but it is there. So I would encourage people to look for this.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. Well, thank you again for being here, Carl.
Hey,
Until
my
next time,
pleasure.
man.
Thank you very much.
So that was it. Do you have any questions or anything?
Yeah,
Do you have
no,
any
thank you
comments
very much.
after it's done and stuff?
No, that's good. That was fun. It's just, as I said, it's a conversation, and it's a topic I like speaking about anyway. So it's hey,
Yeah, I
it's
watched your
always a
episode
pleasure
on
to speak about it.
the Nordic podcast, and it was very
Oh yeah,
fascinating.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
With
I only
Daniel, what's
reached
his
out
name?
to you recently, but I watched that when it came
Mm,
out, and it's like, man, I got to get him on my
right, right, right.
podcast. And
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because I think I did two with him actually,
you
wasn't it?
did. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think I did one a long time ago, which was about the Arabic sources. I think, well, actually, no, it was more about the Viking attacks on Spain.
Uh-huh.
That was mainly that. There was a lot of Viking campaigns in Spain.
Yeah, that was an interesting
And
one.
then
Your
the
other
second
one
one,
with him was also cool about the Crusades and, Scandinavian
yeah, exactly.
culture.
So it was
And
more
yeah.
crusading. Exactly, exactly,
Yeah, that was something I was always
exactly.
curious about. So how he got you to talk about that was amazing. That was a very
Yeah,
valuable episode to learn from.
yeah, it was fun. It was fun to write. It's fun to speak about it, rather. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Because if you go into the sort of later Middle Ages, then you get into the crusading period, and that's colored a lot of the imagery that we get about Islam and Muslims in the Old Norse literature. Certainly, it's
Yeah.
very much informed by that. So it wasn't always very kind, to have to say, and not only not very kind, also very wrong, I have to say. There
Yeah.
was of literature at the time, even French literature, which was the original
Yeah.
stuff that was translated into Old Norse, where they portrayed Muslims as having three gods,
Yeah.
which is like, yeah, cannot be further from the truth. So it's very bizarre, and they have idols and they have statues they worship. They have statues of Muhammad supposedly, and they
Yeah.
worship Muhammad as a god. It's completely off, completely off.
Yeah.
But it was more sort of like it was rhetorical, right? It was sort of like the other, there was these other people.
Yeah.
Uh,
I don't know if you're
they weren't
familiar
really
with
interested in
this,
the truth,
but
essentially.
there's a theory that the concept of the figure Baphomet is, they tried, it comes out of a portrayal of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, where they created this
Oh, really?
idol. Yeah. And like the name,
Yeah.
the etymology of the names and how they kind of like
Hmm.
twisted them in a way.
Yeah. That's interesting because there's just this idea. There was a statue in, or supposedly there was a statue in Cadiz in Spain, um, which is mentioned a lot in both Christian and Islamic literature, well, Muslim literature and Arabic, which was destroyed eventually. So we don't really know what it was. But there was a lot of stories mentioned around it, a lot of mythology and stories mentioned around it. Um, and yeah, from the Christian point of view, there was this idea that it was a statue of Muhammad, supposedly,
Hmm.
which of course it wasn't. It is more likely that it was like a statue of some sort of like probably Hercules or the
Oh,
Phoenician equivalent of Hercules, which is Melkart. It's probably more likely to be that, which makes sense. It was the Cadiz was dedicated to Melkart, who was associated with Hercules, hence the Strait of Hercules, right? The
yeah.
Strait of Gibraltar, the Strait of Hercules. So probably it was more likely to be that. But there were a lot of mythology and stories mentioned like around it. And from a Christian point of view, it was, yeah, so the idea that it was a statue of Muhammad, which is,
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
absolutely untrue. The idea that Muslims would have had a statue of, well, anyone, let alone Muhammad, would have been completely ludicrous. So,
Yeah, and you get to see some of that in also C.S. Lewis's works. Like as I mentioned,
mm,
it's a very Christian story through a pagan lens, and the portrayal of Muslims is they worship like a
mm,
moon god, and that's the
you're right.
moon god, and it's
Yes, yes, yes.
interesting. It's interesting how that carries on throughout history.
Yeah, it does. It does. It's very bizarre because, especially today, because, just use Google, and you'll know that Muslims are monotheists,
Yeah,
obviously. So, but yeah, certainly at the time in the Middle Ages, it was a bit, yeah, they didn't quite really know what's happening, I have to say, or they didn't have much context really, because I have to keep in mind that, people who are doing crusades had contacts, perhaps, but, most people wouldn't,
yeah.
would
You
barely go
just
to the next village over, let alone in the Mediterranean from Iceland.
Yeah, you just kind of take in what you're told. Actually, I heard about that
Yeah.
recently, where it's like, 20 years ago, if your aunt told you something, well, that was the truth of it, but now
Yeah,
because
yeah,
of the
that's it.
internet, it's like, oh, okay,
Yeah,
never mind,
yeah,
actually.
yeah, 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 exactly, exactly. So at the
Yeah,
time, yeah, there were some people who were attempting to understand Islam, and sort of there was a Latin translation of the Quran that was done in the 12th century, by Peter the Venerable. So yeah, there was definitely an attempt at the time to try to understand it, but of course done through a Christian lens, very Christian lens. So there
mm,
was a whole other strand of looking at Muslims and Islam as being a heresy, a heresy of Christianity, right? Because through a Christian lens, they were seeing a group of people who believe in the character of Jesus, but he's not the Son of God. So
yeah,
clearly they're heretics, right? So that was the logic that went through their minds when they're trying to explain this religion that was unfamiliar to them, right?
yeah.
So yeah,
By the way, so is it true Vikings never went to India? They never had any contact with Indians or Hindus that we know of?
we we do not have any evidence. I think that that sort of myth, well, not myth, but where the suggestion might stem from the idea that there might have been, not might, there are elements, there are items that were found in Scandinavia of like, there's a Buddha statue, for example,
Yeah,
a Buddha statuette that was found in Sweden, if I'm not mistaken. Um, but that seems to be more likely a result of trading,
mm,
that thing being traded over and eventually ended up in Sweden rather than anyone going there.
yeah,
So, that's we don't have any evidence itself of of being in India. We have a lot of rune stones that mention where they went. We have rune stones that mention where people traveled and where they died. There's a whole section a whole set, I would say, of rune stones that are referred to as the Ingvar rune stones,
mm,
which is a group of runestones that were erected for people who went on a journey, some sort of campaign with someone called Ingvar, and a lot of them died. So their families raise these stones in their memory. And a lot of them mention where they went, and including sort of this word that they used, Serkland,
Yeah.
which we
Saracen
think
lands.
was the name for Saracen land, exactly.
Yeah.
So they it seems that it seems that that campaign went down somewhere in either what today is Iraq, perhaps, or perhaps Iran, what today is Iran, um, around that region, around the Black Sea, essentially.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there are mentions of that, but we do not get India there, right? India only shows up later on when it's referred
Yeah.
to saints, the saints who went to India and all that. So it's
Hmm.
much later.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean there can never be enough said about the Norse culture, the language I speak,
Oh God, no.
if there were if it
Yes.
wasn't for the Vikings, there'd be no England. No England, no America, so
Yeah.
yeah.
Right. That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. English. In fact, if you go to somewhere like Cambridge, for example, or Oxford, the universities there, the departments that work with Old Norse are generally part of the English department.
Mm,
It's a subcategory of the English department because it's such a big part of the English language, right?
yeah.
Old Norse. It played such a big building block of the language and the culture and the history that it sort of is seen as part of English, essentially, Old Norse. And, Tolkien himself.
Yeah.
Tolkien was in the Department of English. But, he did Old Norse and many other things. He was a polymath, but
Yeah, by the way, I think it's
yeah.
interesting. If I'm not mistaken, he wrote The Lord of the Rings because he felt like the English didn't really have a concrete mythology. But that sometimes
Mm.
confuses me because if I'm not mistaken, the traditions of Old English mythology, shouldn't they bear resemblance to Norse? I mean, Woden,
They
and
would, yeah.
would it not be the
They
same
would.
thing?
I They would be really. They would have been part of the same family of beliefs, certainly. I think one of the issues perhaps that England has, and in that case, is that there's so little written about it
Hmm.
from the time. I mean, like so there wasn't an equivalent of Snorri to
Yeah,
record the information, right? So it seems that it died out too much for it to be salvaged almost as a story. That's what I understand at least. And also, England was Christianized relatively early. Well, not very early, but relatively early. And I say relatively early because as a Mediterranean, Christianized almost immediately. The tradition for us in Malta was that we were Christianized in the year 60.
wow.
So that is a tradition. So we would St. Paul. So 6, 7 centuries is like, oh, way too late. But
Saint
in the
Paul
context
went
of
to
the
the
rest of
island of
Europe, it's like,
Malta.
sorry?
Saint Paul went to the island of Malta.
Yeah. It's in the Bible, actually. It's in the New
Wow, I'm not
Testament.
familiar with that. That's
Uh,
interesting.
yeah. So in the New Testament, the Saint Paul, when he was being transported over to Rome to be executed, um, he got shipwrecked in Malta.
Oh,
Um, So it's mentioned in the Bible, it's mentioned that he was shipwrecked in the island of Melita, which was the name of it in Latin and Roman Malta. Um, and so there's a lot of traditions in Malta about that, right? There's a lot of it
interesting.
is questionable how much what of it was true, a lot of the traditions that came out of that, but it's still part of the identity essentially of Maltese Christendom, right?
That's
It's still a
fascinating.
big part, and he's the national saint of Malta, and all of
Ah,
that.
he's like Odysseus, but a saint, shipwrecked on the island.
And
Interesting.
basically, yeah. And a lot of
Interesting.
stories, like there's a story in the Bible actually mentions that he was attacked by a snake that came out of the fire, and the local people were afraid that he would blow up essentially because of the poison. But nothing happened, and he shook it off. And the
Oh,
tradition is that's why we don't have venomous snakes in Malta,
ah,
because after that, all snakes lost their venom. So, you know, so a lot of these small sort of like traditional stories that sort of became part of Maltese culture sort of is a very common theme. Ireland has the same with, St. Patrick,
yeah.
these stories,
No snakes because of
Mm.
him.
Yeah, exactly. The
Yeah,
same thing, actually. St. Patrick did the
yeah,
same, right? I think, yeah.
yeah. Interesting stuff. Well, thank you
Yeah,
again,
yeah,
Carl.
yeah.
This was great, man.
Hey,
Whenever
my
you get a
pleasure. My
chance,
pleasure.
please email me the picture you'd like for the thumbnail, and then yeah,
Oh, sure, sure. I will do that.
cool.
I will do that.
All right,
Perfect.
you
Thank you
take
so
care then.
much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good afternoon now, I guess. Yes.
Thanks. You as well. Have a good evening.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, bye.